Hello, I'm Matt Davies, and this presentation is one in the Life's Big Questions series. And in this presentation, we want to look at some accurate long-term prophecies. This is part of investigating the overall question, is the Bible a message from a God I can't see? We want to show you that the Bible predicts the long-term future of several nations and cities. Now, this makes it unique amongst religious texts. And the very fact that the Bible does this, and does it so accurately, is evidence that it is from a power far greater than ourselves. Now, when we look at Bible predictions, we are going to see that they are firstly clear and precise. There is going to be no doubt about what they mean. And secondly, they are known to have been written down before the events took place. We are also going to see that they are 100% accurate. And we are going to see that they were written by people who had no power to make them come true. We'll see that they were fulfilled by people who were not aware that they were going to do so. And finally, we'll also see that contrasting fortunes are predicted for different cities and nations, and that the Bible writers made the correct prediction every single time. The predictions in the Bible relate to the nations and cities surrounding the nation of Israel. And in this presentation, we'll look at several fascinating predictions. We'll look first at Egypt, then at another of Israel's lesser-known neighbours, Edom. And finally, we'll see how the Bible prophet Daniel predicted that successive superpowers would lead to the nations of modern Europe. I'll now hand over to Karam Ram in our conference room, who will start by looking at the remarkable predictions about Egypt.
Thank you, Matt. When Egypt is mentioned, most of us think of the pyramids. Tourists visit Egypt to look at the ruins of magnificent temples found there. These monuments are all reminders of Egypt's very long history and considerable greatness. The majority of ruins date back thousands of years. They come from a time when Egypt was ruled by the famous pharaohs. Encyclopaedia Britannica talks about an almost unbroken line of native rulers that lasted nearly 3,000 years. Some of these native rulers built the famous pyramids. This is the Great Pyramid of Giza, built by a pharaoh who reigned around 4,500 years ago. Toward the end of this long line of native rulers, the Bible prophet Ezekiel made the bold prediction, "There shall no longer be princes from the land of Egypt." Ezekiel predicted that Egypt would not have any more Egyptian royal rulers. This was a daring prediction after almost 3,000 years of rule by Egyptian pharaohs. Visitors to Egypt these days see many reminders of how right Ezekiel was. There's a lot of visible evidence of these successive non-Egyptian rulers. This temple in the Luxor temple complex dates from the time of the Greeks. Next came the Romans. These ruins of a Roman amphitheatre are in Alexandria. The Muslim Arabs followed. One of their mosques is built into the ruins of the famous Luxor temple. Other mosques remind us of other foreign rulers. The Hassan Mosque in Cairo was built in the style of the Mamluks. They ruled Egypt for over 200 years. Mamluks were Muslim slave soldiers whose influence and power grew until they became the main military power. The Ottoman Turks then ruled Egypt for almost 300 years. The Alabaster Mosque in Cairo was built in their style. The Ottomans divided Egypt into 24 provinces. The Mamluks, meantime, were still very influential, and each province was ruled by a Mamluk known as a bey. The Alabaster Mosque was actually built by Muhammad Ali, an Albanian who established himself as Egypt's ruler in 1805. During his dynasty, the British had considerable influence in Egypt. This mosque in Cairo is dedicated to President Nasser, who overthrew Muhammad Ali's dynasty in 1952. Encyclopaedia Britannica makes the observation that Nasser emerged as the first native Egyptian ruler in more than 2,000 years. Nasser led a bloodless coup which toppled the monarchy and Egypt became a republic. Nasser was a president, not a royal ruler like the pharaohs. So Egypt continues with no prince, as Ezekiel predicted. Before this period of domination by foreign rulers, the prophet Ezekiel made this comment about Egypt. It will be the lowliest of kingdoms and will never again exalt itself above the other nations. I will make it so weak that it will never again rule over the nations. Egypt has declined from its previous dominant position in world politics. Even today, it is still a very underdeveloped country, just as the Bible prophet predicted. Egypt is dependent on the River Nile for its agriculture. Equally important are the irrigation canals that take water to the surrounding land. The problem was that Egypt's foreign rulers neglected these irrigation systems. This book tells us Ottoman governors and Mamluk beys alike neglected irrigation and related agricultural works, allowing the country's economy to deteriorate. The Ottomans and Mamluks ruled Egypt in this disastrous way for hundreds of years. The prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel predicted these problems. Isaiah predicts the canals will stink, the streams of Egypt will dwindle and dry up, every sown field among the Nile will become parched. And Ezekiel says, I will bring desolation upon the land and everything in it by the hand of foreigners. It's interesting to see that the prophet Isaiah correctly predicted that irrigation problems would devastate Egypt's agriculture. We can also see the accuracy of Ezekiel's prediction that foreigners would be responsible for the devastation. Another interesting prediction made by Ezekiel is that God will sell the land to evil men. For long periods, the majority of Egyptians lived in poverty to support the rulers who lived in considerable luxury. Jason Thompson, in his book A History of Egypt, talks about the exploitation by the Ptolemies, the Greek royal family who ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC. The Ptolemies carefully surveyed Egypt, assessed its productivity, devised a means of local administration designed to extract the maximum amount of revenue. The population of Ptolemaic Egypt consisted of a comparatively small number of relatively privileged Greeks superimposed onto the great masses of native Egyptians, most of whom lived around subsistence level, but whose back-breaking labour supported Ptolemaic society. A later example is that of Sultan Hassan, who ruled Egypt in the mid-14th century. He showed he had no feelings for the Egyptian people by building this magnificent mosque just after people had died in vast numbers from the Black Death plague which struck in 1347. He financed the building from death duties and by confiscating the estates of people who died without heirs. He spared no expense, making the mosque as grandiose as he could. This is just one more case of the rulers treating the Egyptians badly. Even though Egypt is now ruled by Egyptians, the same problem still persists. The contrast between rich and poor in Egypt is very obvious to anyone visiting the country today. Some areas of Cairo are very modern and have very comfortable hotels for the tourists. The vast majority of people live in very poor housing. They eke out a peasant-like existence working the land. Modern roads are used by both modern and ancient forms of transport. We can see that Ezekiel's prediction that Egypt will be treated badly by its rulers has been fulfilled all down history and is still true today. There's another remarkable prophecy about the Egyptians made by the prophet Ezekiel. This is what the Lord says, their cities will lie among ruined cities. No words can be more appropriate to Egypt. There are countless ruins between the modern cities. Most of Egypt's tourism comes from people wanting to visit the remains of ancient cities. The modern city of Luxor is near to the spectacular ruins of ancient Luxor, Karnak and Thebes. The question, where can I find ruins in Egypt, has been asked on the website answers.com. The reply given started, there are ruins almost everywhere. Satellites are now being used to find more ruins. Archaeologists believe they have unearthed only a small fraction of Egypt's ancient ruins. Yet again we can see the accuracy of Bible predictions. Egyptian cities are surrounded by ruins of earlier cities. So to summarise, we've seen that the Bible prophets predicted that Egypt would be ruled by foreigners. These foreign rulers would treat the Egyptians very badly. The prophets predicted that Egypt would continue, but not as a big player in world politics. They also predicted that it would have major irrigation problems and be devastated by foreign rulers. Finally, we saw that Egypt would be a land of ruins. Now let's think about the Egyptian city of Thebes. The site of this ancient Egyptian city is about 800 kilometres south of the Mediterranean, on the eastern bank of the River Nile. At one time, it was the capital city of Egypt. The area has been called the world's greatest open-air museum. Thousands of international tourists come each year to visit its temple ruins. Here are the magnificent ruins of the temple at Karnak, part of the ancient city of Thebes. We can see the past grandeur of the city and its temple from the ruins that we can see today. The size of the people shows the vast scale of the temple. While this enormous temple was still in use, God told the prophet Ezekiel, I will inflict punishment on Thebes and cut off the hordes of Thebes. Thebes will be taken by storm. This prediction about Thebes was finally fulfilled in the 1st century BC. It was besieged by the Greeks. For 3 years it held out against the besiegers, but when it did eventually fall, the Greeks levelled most of Thebes to the ground. The city was taken by storm, just as Ezekiel predicted. The city eventually continued as several hamlets. Here is one of them, now known as Luxor. Compared to the time when it was the capital city of Egypt, the population has drastically reduced. The hordes of people living there were indeed destroyed, as Ezekiel predicted. So we have seen that Ezekiel correctly predicted that Thebes would suffer an attack from a large force. He also predicted that its large population would be dramatically reduced. We'll now look at the ancient city of Memphis. Like Thebes, Memphis is on the River Nile, but it's considerably closer to the Mediterranean Sea. Memphis remained an important city until the Muslims conquered Egypt. It was then largely abandoned and became a source of stone for the surrounding settlements. There are 2 interesting Bible predictions about Memphis. Memphis will be laid waste and lie in ruins without inhabitant. Here we see how literally this has been fulfilled. The site of Memphis is now marked by an open-air museum. The second prediction is even more detailed. This is what the Sovereign Lord says, I will destroy the idols and put an end to the images in Memphis. This detailed prediction was absolutely right about the destruction of the city, including its temples. As we've seen, there are grand temple ruins in many other places in Egypt, but not in Memphis. Egypt isn't the only nation that the Bible prophets mention. There are some interesting prophecies relating to other nations. One of the neighbours of ancient Egypt was Edom. It occupied land at the southern end of the Dead Sea, including some of modern Jordan. Here is one of the spectacular buildings in the ancient city of Petra, a market city of the Edomites. It was on the main trade routes and was very prosperous. The area had flash floods, and archaeologists have found that the inhabitants of Petra controlled these floods by the use of dams, cisterns and aqueducts. The aqueducts can still be clearly seen at Petra. These innovations meant that water could be stored ready for prolonged periods of drought. It enabled the city to prosper in what was a desert area. This meant that it was a welcome oasis on the main commercial routes which passed through. In 106 AD, the Romans took control of Petra, which continued to prosper under Roman rule for a time. But as new trade routes opened up, activity at Petra declined. In 363 AD, a very destructive earthquake hit the area, damaging the vital water distribution system. This earthquake seems to have hastened Petra's end as an important centre of trade. Eventually the city, along with Edom itself, declined and became desolate. This is just as Ezekiel predicted. I will make Mount Seir a desolate waste and cut off from it all who come and go. The prophet Ezekiel refers to Edom as Mount Seir because that's the area where the Edomites lived. When Petra ceased to be an oasis and the trade routes changed, it was very true that those who come and go were cut off. So we've seen that the Bible correctly predicted that the land of the Edomites would become desolate and the decline would be caused by the disappearance of passing traders. That ends our brief look at just a few of the many detailed predictions about Middle East nations. I will now hand you back to Matt, who will look at fascinating predictions about the superpowers that led to the nations of modern Europe.
Thank you, Karen. Most of us are aware of the idea of superpowers. They are countries that exert a significant influence over other nations in the world, like America does today. Now, Babylon was such a superpower in its day. The ruins of its capital city are in modern Iraq, and the grandeur of ancient Babylon can be seen from this replica of the Ishtar Gate, which is at the entrance of the ruins of the ancient city of Babylon. Now, the Jewish prophet Daniel lived under the influence of superpower Babylon. He recorded a dream which the king of Babylon had. It gave an overview of how Babylon would be one of the successive superpowers which led to the nations of modern Europe. Daniel told the king what the dream meant, and he outlined what would happen for the 2,500 years following the fall of the Babylonian superpower. Here we can see the extent of the Babylonian Empire. The prophet Daniel told the king of Babylon, "After you, another kingdom will rise. Next, a third kingdom will rule. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom." Now, the first part of the prediction that Daniel made was, "After you, another kingdom will rise." The Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire around 540 BC. These are the ruins of the city of Persepolis in Iran, which served as the capital of the Persian Empire for several generations, and ruins of a number of colossal buildings exist on the site. The next part of Daniel's prediction was, "Next, a third kingdom will rule." It was in 331 BC that the Medo-Persian Empire was replaced by the Greek Empire, and the famous Greek general Alexander the Great defeated the Persian army. The Parthenon, a temple in Athens, is one reminder of the Greek Empire. The Greeks have had a great influence on our world in many areas. For example, the idea of democracy has its roots in Greek political thought, and Athens was in fact the first city to have a voting system as part of its government. Daniel then went on to say, "Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom." It was around 150 BC that the Greek power began to be overcome by the Roman power, and in the next few years the Roman power expanded and replaced the Greek Empire. The Roman Empire reached as far as England. Hadrian's Wall protected the northern extent of the Roman Empire. Daniel then told the king that the fourth kingdom will be a divided kingdom and will not remain united. We can see that Daniel was predicting that the fourth superpower would not be conquered by another, but would fall apart and become divided. Now, the Roman Empire split into East and West in AD 395, before being invaded by several tribes. And these invasions caused conflict and division, which eventually resulted in the nations of modern Europe today. The flags of the nations of Europe are indeed a reminder of the accuracy of this remarkable prediction made by Daniel. And that ends our look at this fascinating prediction. Let's now reconsider some aspects of these Bible predictions. Firstly, we should check that the predictions were written down before the events took place. Now, historians agree that a Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, was made for the great library in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. It's therefore reasonable to assume that the original manuscripts of the Old Testament were in existence in the 3rd century BC. Now, most of the predictions that we've been looking at were fulfilled after this time, so they must have been fulfilled after they were written down. Secondly, we can see that the majority of the predictions were fulfilled many years, centuries even, after the Bible prophets died. So they themselves had no influence in making the predictions come true. Thirdly, it's unlikely that the people involved in fulfilling the predictions were aware of them. So the predictions were fulfilled by people who had no idea that they were actually doing so. Now, these three amazing aspects make the Bible predictions unique among religious texts. Let's now think about the implications of these remarkable prophecies. We began by looking at the nation of Egypt, and we saw that the Bible prophets predicted that Egypt would be ruled by foreigners who would treat the Egyptians as slaves. The prophets predicted that Egypt would continue, but not be a great big player in world politics. They also predicted that it would have major irrigation problems caused by foreign rulers. And finally, we saw that Egypt would be a land of ruins. Now, how did the prophets know that Egypt was about to have a long period of foreign rulers, despite having just had a long period of Egyptian rulers? How did the prophets know that some of those rulers would treat the country so badly with such disastrous results? Many countries have been conquered by harsh powers, but Egypt has had far more than its fair share, and for long periods. How did the prophets know that the country would have so many ruins? Again, many countries have ruins, but Egypt has far more than its fair share. We then looked at what the Bible prophets said about those two ancient cities of Thebes and Memphis. And we've seen that Thebes would have a violent siege and its large population would be drastically reduced. And by contrast, Memphis would be a total ruin without any population, and there would be no temple remains. Again, we could ask, how did the Bible prophets know which prediction to attach to which city? If the predictions had been reversed, they would have been totally wrong. We've also seen how the Bible predicted contrasting fortunes for Egypt and Edom. Egypt would continue as a weak power, but Edom would decline due to the disappearance of passing traders. Again, if these predictions had been reversed, they would have been totally wrong. In the second part of this presentation, we saw that the Old Testament prophet Daniel predicted that there would be 4 consecutive superpowers, starting with Babylon. These successive superpowers would each overthrow the previous one. And he predicted that the 4th superpower, which was in fact Rome, was not to be conquered by another. Its empire would fragment and become many nations. Now, we've seen that this resulted in the many nations of modern Europe. Now, we could ask, how did Daniel know that there would be 4 consecutive superpowers? Why not 3 or 5 or 7? And how did he know that the 4th would not be followed by a 5th? Furthermore, how did he know that the fourth superpower would fragment? It could have just declined in the same way that Egypt did, for example. Now, in each case, we see the Bible prophets choosing the correct prediction for each situation. Now, politicians would like to know what is going to happen in the world next week, but the Bible prophets made accurate predictions about events hundreds of years ahead of their time. One or two correct predictions could be lucky guesses, but the Bible appears to be getting it right every time. We have only looked as well at one or two predictions in the Bible, and there are many, many more, all equally accurate. And this would seem to imply that there is more than chance and lucky guesses involved. Now, we hope you are beginning to think that there is something special about this book, the Bible. You can find out more information about why the Bible is so special on the Life's Big Questions website, www.lifes-big-questions.org. And you can also send for other Life's Big Questions DVD presentations. We'll give you the address at the end. We hope you'll want to look at the evidence in more detail. We also hope you will want to find out more about the message of the Bible and its relevance to you and your future. Thank you for listening.